Synergy Manufacturing, Jeep Gladiator 1 and 2 inch lift starter suspension system. Starting with the vehicle on flat level ground, make sure the vehicle is in park or in gear and the front wheels are chocked. Working on the ground, raise the vehicle up and place the frame on jack stands and support the axle with jack stands. Otherwise, raise the vehicle on a hoist and remove the rear wheels. Start by removing the rear shock lower eyelet. It helps if you loosen the upper eyelet to let the shock swing out of the way. Remove the upper link on the sway bar. On gas JTs, you don't need to remove the lower link because you're going to reuse them. On diesel JTs, you're going to have to remove the sway bar end links, so go ahead and remove them all the way. Loosen all of the control arm bolts. This is done because there's a lot of friction in those factory joints, and if you leave them tight, the axle won't droop out of the way enough to install the spring without using a spring compressor. The same is true for the rear track bar. Go ahead and loosen the upper and lower track bar bolts in order to let it droop as much as it can. If you have a gas JT, you're going to be installing the sway bar end link drop brackets. In order to do this, you're going to have to remove the parking brake cable bracket and slide the Synergy brackets underneath that, and then reinstall the bolt. Use the shorter M12 bolt and washer from the 8808-01 hardware kit to secure the drop bracket to the frame in the original sway bar link bolt hole. Torque the small brake line bracket bolt to 20 foot-pounds and the large sway bar mount bolt to 70 foot-pounds. If running a 2-inch lift starter system, install the rear bump stop spacers. For our 1-inch lift starter systems, do not install bump stop spacers. You will need to drill 2 holes in each bump pad in order to mount the bump stop spacers. Use the supplied template or measure and mark the holes on each of the bump stops. The holes are on the center line of each bump pad and 7/8 and 3 7/8 back from the front edge of the bump pad. Center punch the marks you made and drill the holes out to 3/8. Line up the holes on the bump stop extensions with the holes you just drilled in the rear axle bump pad. The bump stop extension is angled and the overhanging portion should be towards the front of the Jeep. Install the bump pad with 2 3/8 by 1 inch long bolts with washers into the holes you just drilled from the top down. Install a 3/8 top lock nut and washer onto each of the bolt and tighten the bolts down. Torque them to 60 foot-pounds. To install the springs, you're going to have to droop the suspension out more than the factory intended. Inspect the axle for any wires or cables. Most of these are held in with Christmas tree fasteners, and a simple pry bar can pop those loose. Slowly lower the axle. The axle will droop away and the springs should fall out by hand. Be careful, this might need a second set of hands to do safely. Install the new rear springs. The isolator should be on the top. Slide the spring over the lower stop and then reposition the isolator to line up the small hole with the dimple on the isolator. Reinstall your shocks. In our case, we chose to keep the factory shocks. We are using our 8876-01 in order to make it so that the bump stop spacing doesn't decrease any travel. Torque the upper shock bolt to 80 foot-pounds and the lower shock bolt to 75 foot-pounds. Reinstall the rear sway bar link in the Synergy bracket's lower hole. If you have a diesel JT, the Synergy rear sway bar drop brackets clash with the exhaust. You will not be able to use the drop brackets. Instead, install our longer end links, part number 8861-11. These install similar to the factory brackets. The upper sway bar end link bolt is torqued to 70 foot-pounds and the lower stud is torqued to 60 foot-pounds. Moving on to the front, remove the front wheels. Remove the front sway bar end links from the lower eyelets. Once both sway bar end links are removed, push the sway bar up and out of the way. Loosen both the track bar upper and lower bolts. Do not remove them. Loosen all the control arm bolts. There's a lot of friction in these joints. In order to get the axle to droop far enough, the bolts must be loose. On the frame side of both upper control arms, there is a heat shield protecting them from the exhaust. Remove that heat shield to get to these bolts. Inspect the axle for any wires or cables that could be overextended when the axle's drooped out. Most of these are held in by simple Christmas tree fasteners, and a pry bar can easily remove them. The factory E-locker and the axle disconnect cables may be too short. In order to make sure you don't damage them, disconnect the connector. Be careful not to damage the connector. The factory brake hose and ABS guide can sometimes get in the way. It helps if you remove this as well. Remove the lower shock eyelets. It helps if you loosen the upper shock eyelet in order to let the shock move around. Lower the axle and remove the springs. Remove the lower isolator pad as well. Install the Synergy sway bar relocation brackets. Brackets are not right-left specific. They have a radius to accommodate the axle tube. Insert the relocation brackets in between the stock axle side sway bar link brackets and coil mounts. It may be necessary to tap the bracket into place with a mallet. Loosely install the supplied M12 bolt washer and nut. Once you have the nuts and bolts installed and everything squared up, go ahead and tighten them down to 70 foot-pounds. For our 2-inch starter system, install the front bump stop spacers. For the 1-inch starter system, you do not need to install these spacers. Insert the 3/8 socket cap screw through the top of the spacer and thread the washer or nut from the bottom. Torque this to 35 foot-pounds. Install the front springs. In our case, we used a spring compressor in order to aid getting the spring installed. Depending on your shock and spring combination, you might have more droop than the factory brake line brackets can handle. In this case, we recommend cutting the brake line brackets off to remove that mass and let them move where they need to. Reinstall your shocks. In our case, we chose to keep our factory shocks. For our 2-inch system with bump stop spacing, we also chose to include our 8815-01 front shock relocation brackets. Torque the upper shock bolt to 80 foot-pounds and the lower shock bolt to 75 foot-pounds. Install the sway bar links on the 8855-02 relocation brackets. It's easiest to install the ends loose and then tighten in case the sway bar is not perfectly lined up. Torque the front sway bar end links to 80 foot-pounds. Install the cap on the bump stop. In order to get it to click into place, use a long pry bar and press evenly down on the top. This can take some force, so just be patient with it. Reinstall the wheels and tires and set the vehicle back on the ground. All of the track bar bolts and control arm bolts should still be loose. You need to torque them on the ground to the torque listed in the installation instructions with the weight on the vehicle. Installation is now complete. For more information about this kit, go to synergymfg.com.